Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today, Addressing Scope 3 Emissions, PGS Emissions in APAC. It's a topic I'm really excited to talk about. It's something that we've spent a lot of time working both with customers and internally on, finding the best way for folks to really tackle purchase goods and services or supply chain emissions within their organization. Joined by two esteemed panelists here today, and we'll start with just some introductions from the team here. I'm joined today by both Mark and Katie. Katie, I'll hand it over to you first for an introduction.
Great, thanks, Mitch. And hello, everyone. Wonderful to be here. My name is Katie Martin. I am the Director of Sustainability and Innovation at Avetta. I serve both as our internal Director of Sustainability, managing Avetta's progress and our reporting. And I also support our product teams and our innovation and professional services side of the house, working with groups just like yourself on how to manage supply chain emissions and other ESG concerns. And I'll toss it over to Mark, who's joining me today from Avetta as well.
Thank you, Katie. Good morning. Hello, all. Mark Maiolo here. I'm an account executive with Avetta, looking after our APAC clients, focusing on broad supply chain risk management and partnering with Sustain Life for our carbon emissions calculations across our supply chain. So really excited to be having this conversation today. Thank you, Mitch.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Katie. In particular, our purchase goods and services emissions here. Capital goods, of course, can play into that as well for Category 1 and Category 2 under Scope 3. But when we are looking at Scope 3, what we're talking about in the way that we like to phrase it is your beyond or your value chain emissions. And really here, we're focusing on those supply chain emissions and getting data from your suppliers in order to inform your decarbonization roadmap and your strategy overall. Want to pull up a question, and throughout this process, what we'll have is you can use the chat feature to ask any questions, and that'll come to our panelists, and we'll be able to see those questions, and we'll try our best to address them throughout the session. However, if we don't get to it through the session, we'll be sure to follow up afterwards. That being said, we also will have polls, and so this is where we'll pull up our first poll. Want to get some insight into folks on the call in terms of what you've done currently in terms of your Scope 3 emissions. So take a second and go ahead and answer that poll. We'll use that to kind of inform our discussions later on as well, provide some insight to who we have on the call. While you're doing that, I'll walk through the agenda as well. What we have on here is, first and foremost, we'll talk about drivers to measuring Scope 3 purchase goods and services. So what is really driving organizations to go down this journey to start to calculate those purchase goods and services emissions? We'll jump into some main challenges that folks are seeing in calculating those emissions. We'll go over obstacles to success. So what is preventing success for organizations that are really looking to get a key insight into their supply chain emissions, whether that be getting data from suppliers or working with various levels of maturity within their supply chain. We'll talk about choosing the right method for purchase goods and services calculations. So we'll talk about GHG protocol and what exists in terms of guidance to do these calculations, and what might make the most sense for your organization to pursue. We'll talk about supply chain strategies, go over a few case studies, and finish with some key takeaways. Now, I want to start with just some of the drivers that we're seeing for organizations to go ahead and start to calculate purchase goods and services emissions. One of the key drivers kind of globally, and what we're seeing throughout, not just in APAC, but throughout the rest of the world, is regulatory compliance driving some of this. And now this may not be regulatory compliance specific to APAC. It may also be dependent on where you do business. For example, if your organization does a lot of business in the EU, there's CSRD, which does require Scope 3 emission reporting, which may mean that you as a supplier, someone that is doing a lot of business in the EU will have to report these emissions. And there are also local and other regulatory requirements that are popping up throughout the world. And it's, I think, one of the main drivers we're seeing organizations have to push for, or have to start to calculate these types of emissions. There's also voluntary frameworks we're seeing as main drivers. I think one of the big ones would be SBTI. So anyone that has set, for example, science-based target, if there's an element of supplier engagement in that target, you're going to have to collect emissions from your supply chain. You're going to have to engage with your suppliers and, say you have, for example, supplier engagement target. As part of that, you're going to need both emissions data and actually push your suppliers to start to decarbonize. And because of that, it's really meaning a strong push throughout the value chain to either start to calculate these emissions if they haven't already, but also start to act towards decarbonizing to start to reduce those emissions. And finally, operational improvements. I think it's just, in general, good for business in order to get some of this data from your suppliers in order to really have them move on the journey with you and really start to move the needle through A, getting data, but B, enabling and building the relationship with your suppliers to have them start to reduce emissions. Both Katie, Mark, anything you want to add to that in terms of what you've seen for your clients in terms of what are some of the drivers for purchase goods and services emissions calculations?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in first here, Rich. It's really interesting you mentioned as well this kind of partnership that we're now seeing folks pursue a little more deeply with their suppliers, which is, really predicated on a lot of these regulations moving at lightning speed and shifting from accepting estimations and calculations to driving more of a direct capture from those suppliers, or at least for a percent of your supply chain, and then working with them directly to decrease those numbers that you're, reporting up to the various regulatory frameworks. So we see that pretty frequently at Avetta as we're helping kind of get that transparency into our partners' supply chains to really identify those higher impact suppliers and then think about continuous improvement plans. Because there's been a real rush to data. We all want to get that data and report it very quickly, but we like to also think about what comes after, both driving insights and then how can we use this to deepen the relationships of the suppliers that we know we need to have, proactively working on decreasing these pieces over time. So it's interesting to see even in regions of the world. I'm based here in the States. We are a wee bit behind others in some of these more progressive regulatory components. But we are starting to see a lot of voluntary compliance as well as folks recognize this is just the cost of doing business now. Mark, I don't know if you had any references to, I know sitting in APAC, you all are quite frequently managing these with our partners as well.
Yeah, I think the maturity is a little stronger here, but we're also seeing outside of regulatory pressure, a lot of social and investor pressure for these initiatives. So it's that public sentiment that is driving investment into the right channels with organizations that have that strong sustainability framework and target. And this is all working towards those goals across an extensive supply chain.
Yeah, really good points, both you and I think I think whether it's driven by a regulatory kind of framework or regulations are driving this, or even just kind of table stakes or something that is good for business in terms of organizations wanting to understand better where their emissions hotspots are. It's something that we're seeing more and more, regardless of whether it's just a strict regulatory requirement, especially with some of the customers. And I would say it does vary a bit industry by industry. For example, pharma and retail are two industries we've really seen drive or push for a lot more emission reporting from their suppliers, for example. And it's really cascaded beyond now even just tier one suppliers. I think, first go or first year, what a lot of organizations, especially the big enterprises, are focused on is who they have the most, call it, influence or interest with. And usually that's done maybe by a spend-based approach. But very quickly it kind of becomes, in year 2 and year 3, something we're seeing more and more make its way into like a supplier code of conduct or table stakes to do business with the organization. You have to share your emissions. And a couple good examples we can dig into a little later on there. But yeah, definitely quite a few drivers that are pushing for organizations to capture these emissions and share transparently throughout their value chain. Want to jump into some challenges that we've seen throughout this process and highlight a few examples here as well. I would say from the enterprise perspective, one of the things that we've certainly seen is the ability to demonstrate a commitment, but B, progress towards decarbonization within the value chain. And honestly, a lot of that I found is predicated on getting access to data. I know it's one of the things we talk about very frequently in scope 3 is that it's a data problem. I don't know what my suppliers are doing because maybe they haven't reached a maturity where they can collect and calculate these emissions. Maybe it's a access to suppliers. I'm me as an ESG sustainability professional. I'm very arm's length. I've got to go through my procurement team. I've got to go through my buying team to even get access to my suppliers. I would say, it's not the willingness to do anything. I think, there is talks of, or I definitely have seen supplier fatigue or survey fatigue, sorry, from suppliers as being a pretty key theme. But I think suppliers really want to do something in most instances in this space, but it's just the lack of direct access to and ability to work directly with suppliers from the enterprise perspective, especially when you have a very large supply chain. I think it's something that, especially from the enterprise perspective, when you're talking about tens of thousands of suppliers, oftentimes it feels like I don't know where to start. And I think that's one of the main challenges we're certainly seeing on the enterprise side. I think from the supplier perspective, one of the key themes and I would say it's more of a maturity challenge that they have varying capabilities in terms of doing these calculations. Oftentimes it may be that they've never done scope 1 and 2 before, they've never done these calculations, and their eyes might gloss over as soon as you start walking them through all the acronyms or all the data that you do want to collect from them. So one of the things we work really hard to do is build a strong relationship management plan and really treat it as a win-win with your suppliers in order to collect and calculate this data. Last thing I'll highlight is having a strong data management tool or having access to this data. I think really at its core, the data is only as good as you can take action with it. So making sure you've got some sort of tooling, some sort of way to collect, calculate, and roll this data up in a meaningful way throughout the process. Katie, Mark, anything you want to add based on your experiences with customers?
Yeah, we've actually had a really interesting journey with a Fortune 500 company in the property management space, thinking about how to tackle this both regionally and address the drivers that they need to do there from a reporting perspective, but also how to tell kind of a holistic story and the complexity that comes with those interwoven supply chains. And we've really worked pretty directly a lot with their procurement and supply chain relationship management team to really uncover that top tier of suppliers that are really driving a lot of their material risk and emissions. And when I say tier, to your point, a lot of us kind of default to tier 1 or high spend. That tends to have been the direction thus far and has covered a lot of bases. But what we're really uncovering is there's a lot of hidden risks in your supply chain from an emission standpoint. And even though they may not be high spend, you may only engage with them once every 12 to 18 months, they may actually be a significant contributor to your footprint. So being able to help identify those, liaise with them directly. We are very, very well aware of, survey fatigue. And one of the prides of my tenure at Avetta is we've built a very condensed questionnaire, usually about 10 to 15 questions that hits most of the supplier risk points. And we see about an 80% response rate, regardless of supplier size. So I think the good news is we evolve in this space. There's becoming much more technology enablers to help do this at scale. But it really comes down to, I think, examining your current relationship management kind of content flow and calendar with your suppliers and identifying that short list of folks that you should break up first. When we started with this company, we did 200 in year 1, and then we were able to scale to 6,000 in year 2. And that year 1 data was extremely helpful for them for making the case internally for more resourcing, but also kind of highlighting the hot spots in their supply chain and starting the conversation on decarbonization with them while they queued up the next batch. So I think, again, so much pressure on us to be transparent and report to these groups, a lot of different stakeholders. But I think, iterative is acceptable and even preferable as we think about making data-driven decisions, decarbonization commitments that are rooted in reality, and protecting ourselves against any accusations of greenwashing or challenges there. So that would be my number one takeaway for folks with this too is, don't be afraid to kind of break it up into the digestible pieces for your organization, and recognize that a lot of your suppliers are going to need some time to really understand and properly respond as well, which is why tools like, Sustain Life are fantastic as well for kind of easing them into that process.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Katie. And I totally agree too. Like, I think that because it is such a massive, depending on your supply chain, if you have those tens of thousands of suppliers, it can seem super daunting to get started. One of the things, and we'll get to it at the key takeaways, so kind of bearing the lead a bit on this one, but like I think the biggest thing is whether you're starting with the spend-based approach or focusing on emissions first, I would say the biggest thing to take away is just get started. Even if you're doing that spend-based approach, having a way to identify hotspots, and really this whole process can be boiled down into two actions. A, identifying your hotspots, and then B, pulling on your emission reduction levers. That as long as you have a way to do that with what the program and process you're putting in place, again, whether it be spend-based, whether it be those surveys, I think that's kind of the key to the success of the program. Speaking of which, and one of the things I want to dive into next is obstacles to success. I think it's something that as you're setting a program for the first time and looking at some of the results from the poll, there's a good chunk of folks that are in that situation right now. Some good advice to kind of chew on before you set up your first program. Here are some of the key obstacles we see in terms of success for organizations and rolling out these programs. First, I would say is data. Having access to that data, having access to being able to know the emissions of your suppliers is really something that can kind of flow into that second point as well, that knowing the maturity of your suppliers and their ability to do these calculations and provide you with credible data it can certainly be a really big obstacle. And so finding ways to really build strong relationships with those suppliers, and some examples of things that we've done that I've seen be really successful is run a series of webinars just to educate your suppliers and say, hey, here's what we're doing. Here's why we're collecting this data. Here's what we're looking to accomplish, and provide them with the toolkit. Give them even just, whether that be software tooling, whether that be workbooks and templates on here's a simple way you can get your calculations done so that we can have more informed data for our decision making and really sell it as a win-win. One other piece of advice I can give in the relationship side is not only just kind of like running those webinars and then giving the tooling to your suppliers, run a series of office hours too. Give them opportunities to come in and ask questions, to really feel supported throughout the process. Just knowing that, especially if it's their first time doing it, they may struggle. And finally, that communication. One of the things that I found being very successful with these programs is when suppliers do all this work, they do the calculations and give you this data, they want to know what you're doing with it. They want to know insights. They want to know, like, hey, where can I do better? Or what advice do you have for me with this? By having kind of that two-way communication, great example would be by having a software platform like Sustain Life or something like that to be able to communicate directly back and forth with your suppliers. But even just being able to have those sessions so you can work directly with them allows for them to also move the needle and for them to start to decarbonize and really partner with you on this journey. Katie, Mark, anything to add there?
Oh, that's all pretty strong there, Mitch. I think a lot of these points will be covered in some of those case studies coming up.
Perfect. What I want to do next, and I've got kind of two slides here to walk through choosing the right method for doing your purchase goods and services calculations. So in our GHG protocol, there's 4 methods in order to do these calculations. First, and I would say where most folks typically start, would be in that spend-based approach or spend-based method, where you're applying a commodity-based emission factor based on the commodities and what you've purchased through your organization and purchase goods and services. One of the challenges here, and one of the things I want to highlight, is it's the least precise method. It relies on average data. It doesn't really let you see what is happening within your supply chain. However, that shouldn't discourage you from taking the spend-based approach. I think it's a great place to start to get further insights into the hotspots within your supply chain. Next is the average data method. With the average data method, you're looking at and collecting product specific level data. However, this piece of it still doesn't necessarily, it depends on how this is applied, doesn't necessarily give you your specific supplier emissions. Again, a little bit more accurate, a bit more high touch, but maybe not to the full extent that you might get with both a hybrid or supplier specific approach. With the hybrid approach, it can be a mix of any of the other three methods. But with the hybrid approach, typically you're looking at getting actual data. And what we usually see organizations do here, and what we would recommend, is identifying a tier or a subset of suppliers that you want to get primary data from. One of the typical approaches, and Katie, I really liked your point earlier about, historically this has always been the approach to focus on spend, has been to focus on maybe 80% of your spend and kind of draw the line on where those suppliers are in order to get direct data from them and use that to kind of inform and fill the gaps with any of the other methods to get a really well-rounded picture of your supply chain or the emissions that are associated with it. And last one is the most granular, and it's the supplier specific method. In this one, we're getting direct data, getting direct cradle to gate emissions from our suppliers. That's usually coming from surveys. It could come from them doing LCAs. It's getting really direct information from your suppliers. And just to highlight that too. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Katie.
Sorry, Mitch, sorry to interrupt, but I think there was an interesting question that was raised around the advent of AI in this space and thinking about how that may require less, human engagement to get this flow from suppliers and get this emissions data. And I know like Sustain Life has been doing some advancement in that space too. So I thought it might actually be a good opportunity as we're traversing that right now to speak a little bit to your view on, the AI connection to the relationship management with suppliers and the data extraction.
Yeah, no, great question from Kevin in the audience. And it's something that I would absolutely say AI is going to be very beneficial and time saving for these types of calculations. One of the tools that we've built out for purchase goods and services calculations leverages AI and machine learning to scrape publicly available data. So we leverage data sets like CDP, publicly reported ESG reports to go and collect all that data for you to avoid that survey fatigue that you see with suppliers. So what we'll do is, and this is through, it's a great time to talk about the different methods too, because this is using the hybrid method, where what we're doing is we're taking that data that is reported from your suppliers and attributing it to your spend with that supplier and getting primary data based on the commodities you purchase to calculate your purchase goods and services emissions. So it's a really easy way, and you get also an insights dashboard that'll let you know kind of what next steps are. But it's a really easy way to say, hey, I already have this data for the supplier. I don't now need to go send out a survey. I don't now need to, for example, go and bother them. And we have further insights from there too. One of the things would be we look at percentage of your suppliers that have a science-based target. And, it's really geared towards organizations that are setting their own science-based targets for supplier engagement, because any of your suppliers that have set an SBT already, you can call them engaged. You can say that they've already, they are aligned to the 1.5 degree pathway and they satisfy the requirements for a science-based target. Yeah, thanks for that, Katie. I think that's a really great point. And I think it'll only grow from here in terms of how easy it is to get access to data with AI tooling and things that do exist out there. It does make and alleviate a lot of the lift for collecting and getting access to data. Moving on to again, those different methods and what it looks like. The point I want folks to walk away from here really is that it's not just a one-off exercise, that when you're doing this type of exercise, every year on a continual basis, you're always looking to improve. That if you just take the spend-based approach, again, it's a great opportunity to get a hotspot analysis and get that snapshot in time in terms of where your emissions are. But in future years, most organizations, and you really should be pushing for, and GHG protocol actually mentions this or calls this out, that you really should be pushing for more access to or improved data quality and transparency within your supply chain every year. Katie, Mark, anything to add to that?
Yeah, to your point of, increasing that data quality over time, I think a lot of the regulatory bodies and reporting bodies we're seeing are accepting, if you did direct outreach to suppliers and only saw a 15% response rate, this kind of hybrid then backfill of that data with the estimations. But I think they like to see the transparency in terms of, the percent that you were able to do direct capture on and plans for deepening that penetration in the future. As well as any type of, relationship management and continuous improvement planning you have. We found that to be something a lot of the regulatory bodies are responding really well to. And as you think about your external stakeholders, it's helping alleviate and get ahead of any type of challenges when it comes to data fidelity and transparency. A lot of consumers are becoming quite savvy in this space, and calling a lot of companies to the carpet when it comes to the data story. So having that qual and quant and our future planning story packaged together is really helpful in setting your plan up for success.
For sure. Yeah, I think even starting with kind of some of those business objectives too, in terms of like, what do you want to see from both a qualitative and quantitative perspective, really helps drive the engagement with your suppliers. And thank you for those that responded to the poll there too. Some really great insights in terms of the organizations that have gone through PGS calculations before. Seems like hybrid was the most common approach, which I think does make a lot of sense depending on where folks are with the journey, followed by spend-based. Thanks for sharing that information. I think that's really great to see where organizations are today. Want to talk about supply chain strategies next. And this is really where it comes down to, in terms of A, those business objectives, but B, where you can get access to and really what's going to drive success for your engagement with your suppliers. We really see a big push for primary data. We know that's kind of the gold standard. We know that as much primary data as you can get, that's really what you want from your suppliers. But there are also options for using proxy data. And one thing I'll call out too is with that proxy data, it can be informed by the primary data that you're collecting from your suppliers. One example I'll give is with a large enterprise organization we are working with, where they were using the EEIO, extended economic input output emission factors based on spend. However, they found that they were very different from the emissions that they were seeing directly from their suppliers. So rather than just using EEIO, and it's something our tool supports, what they were doing instead is building an emission factor based on the primary data they were receiving from their suppliers. So again, it falls in that hybrid approach category, but they were looking at each commodity and looking at percentage of coverage by spend. So say they had 10 suppliers that sold them one specific commodity, and they had 80% of their spend on that commodity covered by those suppliers, they would build an emissions intensity factor based on dollar spend for the remaining 20%. And that threshold did vary depending on the specific commodity they were looking at and their confidence that that was the most accurate data. But again, it just allows you to, just to highlight the example that you can be pretty flexible with the hybrid approach. And by looking at and getting the correct numbers for your specific supply chain, really lets you build a strong strategy around the commodities and how you can decarbonize those specific commodities. The allocation approach, and the last thing I want to hit on here is just the LCA approach, where when you're doing LCAs, it's something we've seen be really great for looking in and digging into specific products. However, if you want to build a true decarbonization strategy and plan, you really need, I would say, at least annual data. That if you're doing the LCA, it's really great for a snapshot in time. And for those who aren't familiar with life cycle assessment or LCA, you're basically digging into one specific product through its cradle to grave emissions and looking at that product life cycle in much more detail to come up with detailed emissions for that product. However, it's a pretty involved process. And the only way you can show decarbonization is by doing that LCA on an ongoing basis, which is why we typically see organizations move more towards primary data or proxy data. Again, so you can get that annual update on those emissions, something that can be informed to truly drive decarbonization across your organization. Katie, Mark, anything you want to add there?
You just triggered two thoughts for me, and I'll be quick because I know we're going to get into the great case studies. I think what we are trying to prepare clients for, and we've seen translate, is as you move more into primary data and direct capture from your suppliers, be prepared for any numbers that you've put out in the last few years, if you've been doing this for some time, to oscillate wildly, and be prepared to tell that story. When you're moving from estimations and guesstimations and proxy data into direct capture, we typically see a significant increase. I think that's a good thing as we get closer to, true emission source, and then we're able to tackle it appropriately with our suppliers. Obviously, anyone sitting in the sustainability space or marketing space is already cringing at what that storyline is going to be, that we doubled our carbon between 2024 and 2025. So just be prepared for that potential eventuality. And be thoughtful in terms of narrating how this actually is a positive and the continued work you're doing with your suppliers. I just wanted to put that out there because I know that's been something actually this year, as a lot of our folks get year 2 data from more and more suppliers that we've been seeing kind of translate across.
Yeah, great call. And yeah, it's funny. I've seen it go either way too. I think as you get more accurate data, as you start getting data directly from your suppliers, I think again, the spend-based approach and those average emission factors, commodity-based emission factors are a great opportunity to get hotspots. But once you start to get actual data, I've seen it go either way, go either way up or way down. And just being prepared to tell that story, yeah, that's great advice. Because, yeah, you can certainly have people asking why the numbers have changed so much. With that said, Mark, I'll pass it over to you to go through a case study.
Sure, thank you. So we've got a couple of case studies here. This first one is with a Singapore-based offshore oil exploration organization. And as you can imagine, they've got a pretty heavy carbon footprint. They've set some pretty aggressive goals for carbon neutrality and net zero over the next few decades, but also other ESG factors like anti-bribery, modern slavery, and then alignment to things like the supplier code of conduct that you touched on earlier, Mitch. And taking that holistic approach, they are looking at a number of different ways to achieve that participation across their supply chain for this awareness and visibility. So hitting some of those key points that Mitch had touched on earlier around communication. So running those webinars, town halls, and the office hours, and then starting to feed that information into reporting so that we can start trending over time. And then that feedback and that information back to the suppliers to communicate to them the value of their participation in these programs that ultimately gives them that iterative success. So it is a multifaceted approach that they're taking to achieve that awareness and visibility, and ultimately then achieving those carbon goals that they've set for themselves. So as we've moved forward into the next slide, we're starting to take that complementary approach around that broad risk management and including the ESG metrics into that. And so while they're participating in that supplier engagement program through procurement and sustainability challenges or channels, they're starting to now capture that information around their ESG and emissions targets. And we can start seeing this information that's now being captured, which is giving them that focus area to work out where they need to put their attention across their supply chain. And as we touched on there, and I think, Katie, you'd mentioned there that if we've got those initiatives in place, we're already in a pretty good spot with our suppliers, but maybe we need to start focusing on some of those suppliers at the bottom end of that chart there on the left, where suppliers aren't necessarily focusing on these emissions target strategies. The secondary benefit on the next slide now with this organization is that they're starting to capture this emissions information across all materiality levels. And we're seeing there around an 80% completion time or completion of those assessments that provide some benefits back into these organizations, even from a reporting perspective. So there's a significant reduction in how they are capturing these emissions values that are going into things like their annual statements. So their financial reporting is now complemented by some pretty specific information that they are able to lift and shift out of these platforms and use for secondary purposes as well. And obviously this is the start of a very long journey for them, but putting them into a very strong position to achieve some of those targets that they are looking for.
That's great. Thanks, Mark. And I might want to jump into kind of building off the top of like looking at reduction within your supplier emissions and kind of their process as well. I think there's a great question in the chat here from Julian around, would primary data be informed from LCA calculations? Just talking about them giving this data to you and what the process looks like from the supplier perspective. Katie, did you maybe want to answer that one?
Yeah, and I typed up a short answer, but I think, it's a complex situation, but essentially LCAs are more utilized to kind of identify which materials or vendor or piece of the product process is prime for kind of decarbonization efforts. You can see where there's spikes. However, if you are in a space where you have a limited number of SKUs that you're working with or products that are quite similar, you can do a singular LCA on one product and extrapolate across. So if you're not getting direct emissions data for those pieces, you can repurpose it or use it as part of your calculation estimations. But that's more of a secondary kind of benefit of it. It's really about where are we going to get the most ROI and bang for our buck in thinking about our decarbonization efforts. And if it's closer to the cradle stage and extraction and working with our mineral and mining suppliers, or if it's in our distribution and transportation piece and thinking about fuel mixes with our fleets and refrigerated trucks and things of that nature. So we do see LCAs being a little more popular in the manufacturing space, people working with really core products and obviously those in the like electronics, agriculture, and textiles. To really start to penetrate into the full kind of life cycle and value chain of a singular item and use that to kind of build a decarbonization strategy. So sorry, that's a bit more of a longer answer probably than anyone expected, but I guess the takeaway is it's complicated, but it's worth utilizing if you're in any of those industries I just mentioned.
Yeah, no, really great points, Katie. And I think just in general, I want to focus back on the case study in just a second here, but I think it's something we've seen as well, certainly from the LCA perspective. I'd say it's really focused much more on actual product producers or industries that create products, where they can share that information with end customers or where they can actually share directly based on those products. And again, I feel it gets much more of a snapshot in time. And it's more of a here's what this looks like right now. And in order to show decarbonization requires doing that LCA on an ongoing basis or continually getting information fed in order to be able to show progress towards any sort of decarbonization efforts.
And maybe one just really crisp example, there's a great TED talk on this about like using LCAs to inform product design because they examined the footprint of a water kettle, electric water kettle, and they thought about all the components, the construction, the manufacturing, the transportation. And by and far, what they found is the highest spike in GHG was in the utilization. It was in the consumer using the water kettle over and over and over to heat up more water than they actually needed for that use. And then that over time, how that contributed to that product's imprint. And so what they were able to do is use that information to design a kettle that had more visible demarcations for 1 cup, 2 cup, or et cetera, like common use cases for the consumer to hopefully mitigate that over time. So that's kind of the interesting things that LCAs can pop out for you. But as you imagine, reporting, I need to get scope 3 in, that insight is interesting, but not necessarily going to help you kind of drive some of those numbers. So they're kind of parallel tracks when we're thinking about this. And it's great at getting a broader sense of the story and thinking about operational changes you can make, but less about driving direct reporting.
Yeah, very cool example. I know I'm going to look at my kettle next time I make a cup of tea to see if it has any of those markings. Mark, I want to turn it back to this example too. Any advice or guidance you could provide to the audience in terms of, I want to dig into like the supplier survey and questionnaire in particular. I think it's, we talk a lot about supplier fatigue or sorry, survey fatigue that suppliers are seeing. Any advice you could give to the audience in terms of designing that questionnaire?
Yeah, I think making it as simple as possible. So the way that we take that approach is to deduplicate as much information as possible. We're taking supplier profile information and marrying that with these specific question sets to start informing or categorizing those suppliers. So we're not re-asking the same questions from a procurement space, from an insurance space, health and safety, and then sustainability. We're collating all of that information to streamline that experience from a supplier perspective. And I think in a practical example, and a great question that the audience can ask themselves is, do we send the same Excel spreadsheet to every single supplier, regardless of the goods and services that they provide? And having that tailored experience instead of that one-size-fits-all approach seems to result in much stronger participation rates and ultimately a greater visibility across your third parties.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I think have you ever done anything with the suppliers to kind of solicit their feedback on the survey as well? Because I think that's something we've seen be really successful too, where I mean, sometimes, you'll often get those suppliers that say like, I don't like the survey because I don't like to respond to surveys, but just in general, in terms of like both soliciting feedback in terms of, the types of questions they're asking, but also B, in terms of materials you can provide them to be successful.
Yeah, I think Katie's ready to answer this one.
Yeah, sorry. And again, things that make me happy as both a product manager and a sustainability professional. We actually have suppliers proactively taking our we call it a PQF, but our sustainability form response as a way to proactively meet their client needs. They're getting their RFP requests that need this information, and they're using Avetta and Sustain Life to preemptively get kind of a RFP response in place and get those numbers together. And we've had a substantial amount of suppliers now that have just set up accounts primarily to go through that process, both to get their score and also to think about how they can better position themselves in their business in this environment. One of those large companies I mentioned we work with now takes the emissions component of a supplier into account during its responsible sourcing and procurement cycle, which means it's a weighted non-financial metric right now. But in time, they've been coaching their suppliers that by 2028, your emissions will account for this amount of your consideration and our project review. And so as you think about that as a supplier, and these are some of their larger tier suppliers too, but all the way down to some of their SMBs. So a lot of motivation now to think about this and what the true cost of doing business is. So we're seeing a lot of rigorous and proactive response there. I mean, of course, there's still a little kvetching here and there, but I think folks are seeing this like they did after OSHA and after SOX as well, as like, this is just the cost of doing business now. I factor this in accordingly. I staff if I need to. And they're starting to better understand the data preparation they need to have to be able to meet these needs. So I'm excited to see it, but yeah, there's still, a few late adopters that we're helping bring along too.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, to that end too, something that we've seen a lot of is it really is kind of the carrot or the stick approach. And I think it does vary industry by industry. I think there's certain industries, I mentioned too already, like retail and pharma, that have kind of leaned a little bit more on the stick approach, where there's a couple examples of large enterprises that have said, even to their tier one suppliers, you have to set a science-based target or we're not going to do business with you. And they've been really kind of forceful on that. And there's varying opinions with that too. But there's also really great examples in the retail space. There was just an article I was reading today about a major retailer that they acted almost as a consultant for each one of their suppliers. teaching them how to and giving them the tooling to actually build out a program on their own. I would say, depending on where your business is or where you lie with that approach, both can have kind of their the right place, right time. But making sure that you're set up for success with having the tooling and whichever approach you do take is backed by the ability to follow through and really enable your suppliers to get the data you need in order to actually start to decarbonize. I think we've got one more example in here. Mark, might turn it over to you for this, and then
Thank you.
wrap up with some Q&A.
Sure. Conscious of time, so I'll go quickly through this one. Pacific National, being an Australian-based rail operator, have been working with Avetta for quite some time on broader third-party engagements. And over the last few years, they have evolved their sustainability position and have taken that incremental approach that you mentioned earlier, Mitch, that, let's start with a base set. Let's start analyzing our information. Let's start targeting maybe some of our more critical service providers, and then expanding the program beyond that. So they've really taken that crawl, walk, run approach with this. And ultimately, the benefits that they're getting now is that they're nearly at 80% compliance across a broad range of their suppliers, using a very simple process that is easy to complete for their supply chain. Centralizing that service with the rest of the supplier engagement programs has allowed that and then facilitated that, while also giving them those tool sets as complemented by Sustain Life to make it very simple for them to participate. I think, do we have one more slide there? I think, is that it? That's the one, sorry.
One quick question on this too. Same kind of question as the last one too, but for someone that was looking to replicate this, like that crawl, walk, run approach, what would be one piece of advice, or how would you guide an organization to really think about that and do it comprehensively?
I think that comes down to best practice. It is leveraging the experience of the people on this call here. We are the ones that have done this many times, and most likely in the industry that you are participating in. And we can take that experience to formulate that plan. So it's taking the lessons from previous implementations. It's understanding what is absolutely critical to capture, and then evolving from there. Obviously, it'd be great to take a wholesale approach and take everything on day one, but understanding the consequences to your supply chain really need to be factored into that end user experience, so that we are able to achieve those 80% compliance rates from day one.
Yeah. And one of the things I really like too is having those KPIs, or having that kind of goal to track and measure success of the program. Because oftentimes what I found too is with a lot of these PG&S and supplier engagement type programs, it's, you start kind of with the shotgun approach of, let's get all the data from everyone and just get as much data as we can throughout the process. And I think, it's aspirational. I like it. I think if you could get all the data, that would be fantastic. But I think it kind of, with the crawl, walk, run approach, marrying that to some sort of KPI, whether it be, we want to have compliance by tiers. We want to have compliance by spend. We want to have compliance by even hotspots identified from a spend-based approach. I think having those KPIs so you can really track the success of your program over the years, because it should continually be evolving, will be super key to continually improving and building upon, even making the case for getting more resources towards the program year over year.
And I think, Mitch, you're hitting on something really interesting, and a few folks have asked this in the chat too, around what does the tiers mean when we're talking tier 1, 2, 3, and 4? Like, what does that mean? And I know this was really interesting coming in because on the safety side of the work that Avetta does, tier 1 or tier 2 can be a little more crisp. It's typically about your direct connection to that supplier and spend. And I love how we kind of translate that over to the sustainability side. But what it really indicates is, I don't know how familiar folks are with materiality on this side. I imagine quite at this point. But as we think about the material impact of those subcategories under scope 3, and especially of our purchased goods and services, We take into account the different risks associated with that. So based on what we understand of the vertical you occupy and the suppliers that you have in your chain from classification, which ones are known to be really high contributors in your industry or just in general? Which ones do you have the highest spend with? And then any internal considerations that are drivers for your sustainability goals that we want to layer in. So for Avetta, it's a bit of a bespoke approach. We have a proprietary risk model where you can give us your suppliers and we can put it through and say, here are the ones spiking high for your E, for your S, and for your G, and be able to then kind of segment and prioritize that way. A lot of that is built on the great work from IFRS and the artist formerly known as the Value Reporting Foundation and SASB, et cetera. But that's what we mean when we say tiers. It could be as simple as your high spend, but we typically kind of layer in a couple of complexities that we know to help better prioritize. And then we also actually get into the classical tier 2 and tier 3, which is you have your direct connected suppliers who are tiered, but who are they working with? And who are they outsourcing to? And that's where a lot of hidden risk happens, especially and unfortunately when it comes to labor challenges that we also support, but on emissions as well, because these folks know how to write the RFP and have everything in a row when it comes to reporting their emissions, but we don't know what they're pulling in from a sub perspective. So again, I'm overly verbose today, but hopefully that was helpful. And I don't know, Mark, if you want to add anything on to how we've been approaching tiering, or if there's any specificity from the APAC region that might be helpful.
No, I think you've covered that one. Thank you.
Perfect. Just before we get to Q&A, want to wrap up with a few key takeaways. First and foremost, I think we all know that supply chain emissions are a really key point or a really key facet of any sustainability strategy for majority of organizations. Regulations are certainly pushing towards more requirements for reporting and doing this type of calculation in order to adequately meet those reporting requirements. Certainly there can be challenges with managing your supply chain emissions and calculating purchase goods and services. And you really need to be thoughtful with the approach that you do take. Picking the correct method and partnering with folks that can really ensure success of your program is very key. But the one thing I want people to walk away from this session today with is don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Even if you're just starting with spend-based, even if you're just, and I say just, it still is an exercise. If you're doing the spend-based calculations, it allows you to identify hotspots and build a strategy for your program. Don't let the kind of fear or some of the challenges that we've talked about today scare you away from getting started. Even just starting with spend-based can allow you to build a really strong strategy for decarbonization or for looking and engaging meaningfully with your supply chain. That being said, want to pull up some of the questions that we have here. There's one in here that just popped up. Probably not a scope 3 question, but PN as a large rail operator must have a transition plan to move to battery, electric, or other lower emissions locomotives. Mark, do you maybe want to touch on some of their strategy and anything that you are willing or able to share?
Look, I don't have anything specific to share about Pacific National, but I'm quite interested in this space personally and seeing what's happening with battery technology. Obviously, there's challenges about heavy freight and the energy intensivity of locomotive transport. I think the technology is evolving, and obviously it's a commercial decision for large organizations to move to these sort of strategies into the future, but we're evolving at such a rapid pace that I think it's a bit of a watch this space, and something's going to be happening pretty soon.
Yeah, this is such an interesting space too, because I think this is half sustainability folklore, but I'm going to repeat it anyway. And the AI gods or Google can come for me, but essentially plastic was originally one of the first upcycle, recycle strategies that we had, as it's a byproduct of refining petroleum and other elements. And folks were like, this byproduct is happening. How can we use it and not have it be waste? And then we created demand, and it's kind of this self-fulfilling piece. And Lego actually just took on something similar where you're thinking about like, what are the decarbonization and transition efforts that these major groups are making, like Pacific National to move away. And they started experimenting with replacement materials for this PFAS and this off-put, trying to find more sustainable materials to make their core products. And what they found was there really isn't anything thus far. Everything that they came up with just had like a 3x kind of carbon output than what they had thought. And so what they instead did was shifted to recycle, repair, and reuse. And they started building this idea of this legacy, familial connection. Everybody has the love of Legos. How can we repurpose and refine them and have them be things that are handed down or retooled? You bring them into Lego and they turn it into something new for you, et cetera. So I think we're still in that really interesting experimental and innovation space where we're waiting for technology to kind of catch up with us too, with some of these shifting needs in terms of materials and fuel and whatnot. So as Mark said, like keep your eye on this space and even join part of the conversations. A big piece of ESG maturity that we see with orgs is joining these coalitions. Lego actually partnered with a couple of other companies in this experimental space. They gave their suppliers leeway to fail on meeting operational demands in order to allow them to take these risks and find different materials. And so there's a lot of folks that are using their purchasing power and collaboration to find ways to elevate the decarbonizations of the entire vertical. So yeah, I just thought that was interesting. Sorry, I'll get off my sustainability soapbox a little here.
No, really well said. I totally agree. And I actually really like that point about giving them the space to fail. Because I think that's oftentimes too that suppliers can certainly get, I don't know if scared is the right word, but kind of put off on like, oh, I've got to, to meet the requirements of XYZ customer, I've really got to and I don't know what I'm doing. I think, it kind of might limit the, call it creative lens or the ability to kind of go outside of some of the typical approaches that we do see. The next thing I want to highlight, it's not a question, but Katie, I saw your response and I really liked it in the chat here. So the comment from Julian was ROI is an interesting metric. Translating emissions reporting reduction into financial return is challenging without monetized value associated with emissions. Katie, do you maybe want to elaborate on your response there?
Sure. Essentially, we're finding a couple of different channels. If you're in a highly regulatory environments, one, I'm jealous. Please keep pressuring my pitiful country to catch up. But right now what we're seeing is it's risk and cost avoidance. So by taking these steps, you're bringing down your carbon and you're avoiding sanctions, penalties, fines. A lot of decarbonization efforts actually result in cost efficiencies because you're making packaging lighter, which means it's fewer materials to make and costs less to transport, or you're reducing waste and consumption and outputs and things of that nature. So a lot of times these actually have really critical direct impacts on the business because it's about efficiency and reduction, going from paper to digital, et cetera. The other piece we're seeing, I kind of alluded to, which is this is becoming a big part of how people do business, whether you respond to RFPs or not. Because people absorb your carbon now as part of doing business with you as a scope 3, and that's going to cost them literally and figuratively, they want to make sure they're working with the least emitting partners as possible. So it's a really strong reputational and brand driver externally with your consumers if you're B2C, but also in your business and collaboration efforts as well. I think we might have a resource on this I can send to folks so that we can send that and follow up as well. But like making the business case for sustainability, retention and recruitment driver, now that we're having trouble with really kind of brain drain and the employee networks that we're dealing with, and they're hyper competitive in terms of where they want to land. All sorts of really great factoids that are both soft and hard metrics to help build this case and continue investment, or maybe even grow it, because I'm sure most of us are wearing multiple hats at this time too.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's a great point to end on, Katie, kind of forward looking and, that there definitely is a very strong need for talent in the space too, at the same time to tackle a lot of these problems. Katie, Mark, want to thank you so much for your time and your insights today. It was great hosting the webinar with you. With that, we'll wrap it up. Thanks, everyone. Take care.